This is my assignment 4.1 on ethical and legal issues in sport and exercise science research. Firstly, here's a definition of ethical from dictionary.com. When something that is morally correct isn't followed, this is an ethical issue. There is also a definition of legal here from the Business Dictionary. Legal issues in research are when the boundaries of civil law are broken. And there is also the ethical clearance process. There are a number of steps to this. Firstly, your research will be analysed and compared against the BASES Code of Conduct to see whether it's ethical or not. The applications will then be sent to an independent specialist panel who will also check whether the research is ethical or legal. If so, it will be passed on further. The application will then be reviewed in a risk-benefit analysis to see whether the benefits outweigh the risks or vice versa. A research product should always have higher benefits than risks. Lastly, it will be checked as to whether everyone that is involved in the study is protected, such as the participants. If your application is reviewed by a review committee, they could accept ethical clearance. They make many changes to the research, however, if there are a number of ethical issues. On the other hand, there may not be any ethical issues and they won't have to make any changes at all. During World War II, the Nazis held prisoners in concentration camps. They used these prisoners to conduct cruel, torturous experiments. This was entirely against the prisoner's will and they were treated with very little care. An example of an experiment that was conducted was investigating the effects of varying temperatures to see at what point the prisoner became unconscious, or even more severely, deaf. Another example of a research study was investigating the effect of different levels of oxygen on the prisoners and the lack of oxygen at altitude. Both of these experiments were solely to the benefit of the German Luftwaffe pilots, only for specific circumstances that they may experience. In conclusion, the prisoners were subjected to extreme physical and mental harm, even leading to the death of some prisoners. So these are examples of significant theorists within research. Firstly, in August 1971, the Stanford prison experiment was conducted. It was an investigation to measure the effect of the psychological effects of perceived power. Volunteers were randomly assigned jobs as either a guard or a prisoner. Zimbardo informed the guards they told the guards to be forceful of the prisoners, and some prisoners also behaved in a certain way just to benefit the researcher. And many guards were even told to be very authoritative and controlling towards the prisoners, subjecting them to psychological torture. Therefore, there are ethical issues within this study because the prisoners would have suffered high levels of emotional harm and distress. And then secondly, the Milgram studies were conducted in 1974. Milgram was intrigued in researching to see what lengths people would go to in obeying instructions if harm and torture was involved. He investigated how much it would take for average ordinary people to commit atrocities. So two people would go in a room at once, they'd draw two straws, and whoever drew the shortest straw would get electrocuted in a chair, so this is the learner. However, this would be fixed so that the confederate always got the short straw, and the other individual, referred to as the teacher, would administer a fake electric shock every time the learner got an incorrect answer to a question. The electric shock would increase every time a wrong answer was given. The teacher would be forced to do this to the other person, and there would be no option to withdraw from this experiment. So firstly, one ethical issue with this would be emotional harm, because the learner will be made to feel very distressed and anxious about being electric shocked, even though they're not going to be. They don't know this, so they'll be very anxious about this. And it's also unethical because the participants aren't being given the right to withdraw. There is deception, so the experiment's fixed, so the confederate always gets electrocuted. And this is the Nuremberg Code, so this is a set of ethics principles introduced following World War II, and it meant that research had become objective to the participants, and it was solely based on their will, rather than the researcher having all the power and doing whatever they choose to the participants. So these are the 10 key points of the Nuremberg Code here. Moving on to the Declaration of Helsinki. So here are some facts regarding the Declaration of Helsinki. Subsequently, there were many outcomes as a result of this. It was made clear that consent must always be given by the volunteer for a research study. Studies must be based on good, fair, unbiased science. For a study to be carried out, the benefits must outweigh the risks. Participants will always have the right to withdraw from the experiment at any given time. And lastly, it's essential that the researcher is qualified. And moving on to bases. So the roles of bases are stated here. The key three principles of bases are reliability, objectivity, and validity. So reliability is when the results of research are repeatable. Objectivity is when something isn't influenced by personal opinion. And validity is how close results are to the true value. This is the bases code of conduct. So firstly, ethical clearance is when a research study is analysed and must be approved by a recognised body. Informed consent must be included prior to a research study so that the participant knows exactly what the experiment consists of and potential consequences of it. Thirdly, all confidential information, such as personal information provided in a questionnaire, must only be seen by the researcher and nobody else. Any personal information given must be kept private as a result of the Data Protection Act 1998. Next, there is competence. Researchers must recognise the boundaries and their ethical limitations, and they must operate within their research. And in the Code of Conduct, there is professional conduct. And this essentially states that any research must only be in the client's best interests. So moving on to the scenarios now. So here's scenario 1. So one positive aspect of this scenario is that the gymnast volunteered to take part. This is a key ethical issue because people should only take part in a research study if they actually want to. Also, the research carried out a risk-benefit analysis. This is vital. The Declaration of Helsinki states that a research study should only be carried out if the benefits outweigh the risks. In this instance, the researcher identified that the routines were very basic and risk-free, whereas the potential benefits could be significant. Therefore, it was worth conducting the study. Also, the researcher included a health and screening questionnaire. This is essential to identify whether certain individuals are eligible to take part in the research study. So, for example, one of the individuals could have a condition like maybe asthma, and if they don't have an asthma pump available to them, then it would be dangerous for them to take part in the study. It's also vital that the gymnasts have the right to withdraw from the experiment at any given time. Both the Nuremberg Code and Declaration of Helsinki state that this is the case. It would be extremely unethical and morally wrong for the participants to be forced to carry on against their will. In contrast, a major ethical issue with this scenario is the fact that there is no informed consent or parental consent. The participants should always be asked to sign a form stating exactly what the experiment will consist of and what the consequence will be. In addition, the fact that they are under 12 and there was no parental consent is very severe. To improve this scenario, the parents should have been given a form to sign to say that their child can take part. And next, the scenario states they have to complete a questionnaire which will be made public. This is extremely unethical as the researcher is failing to keep the gymnast's personal data protected, which is one of the requirements within research. In order for this experiment to improve, personal data must be protected and kept confidential. This also links into research responsibility. The researcher is failing to meet this as they aren't protecting the clients, and it's putting them at risk. And there are a number of potential consequences of this scenario to both the researcher and the participants. A consequence to the participants could be that it could cause harm to them and severe emotional harm. In the questionnaire, they give very personal details about themselves, and the fact that this will be known to the public could cause them extreme stress. For example, they'll provide their name, their home address, potentially their phone number, and this could leave the child very worried about who may have these details about them. And the researcher could also have some very severe consequences. The fact that the participants are under 12 means that their parents must give consent to take part. By doing this, the researcher is breaking the civil law. As a result, the parents of the gymnast would be liable to take the researcher to court, leading to a tribunal. This would almost certainly mean that he'd be suspended from his job, and he could also get a very large fine. The researcher will lose his BASES accreditation, meaning that he will no longer be competent to carry out research experiments. And in order for the researcher to have any chance of eventually getting their status back, they must have lots of ethical training. The researcher will be informed by BASES to have some ethical training, as there are a number of major issues with this researcher, and then he'll be taught how to conduct ethical and legal research studies correctly. So moving on to the next scenario. So, firstly, a positive aspect of this scenario is that there is a participant disclaimer. This is something that the parents will sign stating that if there is any form of incident or injury, then the researcher isn't responsible and cannot be blamed for it. However, a negative aspect is that the scenario is biased and there's no equality. Equality is essential in order for the research to be ethical, and the researcher in this scenario deliberately excluded anyone that wasn't white from the experiment. The researcher used deception on the parents, and this is a major ethical issue. In the consent form that the parents signed, he stated that the gymnasts would be completing basic moves that they would easily be able to complete. However, he essentially lied to them because after conducting the research study, the gymnastic routines were actually far too difficult for the gymnasts, and it caused some of them to injure themselves. This also links to health and safety issues. Health and safety must be considered within research experiments, and risk assessments should be carried out too. This researcher clearly took minimal care or consideration to the safety and well-being of the gymnasts, and therefore to improve this scenario, the researcher should have provided equal opportunities to everyone, been truthful to those taking part, and should have been far more careful when considering health and safety. So again, in this scenario, there'll be consequences to both the participant and the researcher. Physical harm will be caused to the participant, as they'll hurt themselves trying to complete gym moves that they haven't done in the past. The researcher will lose a significant amount of professional credibility. This is because he'll get very bad reviews for causing young gymnasts to sustain injuries. They'll get a bad reputation and no one will want to be involved in their research studies anymore. For the researcher to try and rebuild their career, they'll be told by bases to have some ethical training to learn how to correctly conduct research. And now moving on to the last scenario. So, yeah, here's the consequences which we just went through. So here's the last scenario. So there's not really much to say that's positive, but firstly, there's scientific misconduct here because the researcher essentially, when it came to the first run where they weren't using beetroot juice, they used the exact time, whereas the researcher the second time rounded up to the next minute, which was when they consumed the beetroot juice. So this is essentially, you can see here that the research is funded by a company called Beat It, which is a beetroot juice company. So essentially he's being paid to make this company look like it's effective on sports performance. So this is a major ethical issue, and yeah, they've essentially kind of bent it and got a way around it to try and make this company look better. And secondly, confidentiality is a major problem here. So they all completed a questionnaire containing their personal information. However, the researcher was supposed to keep this confidential. However, he proceeded to add the personal details onto the Beat It website. And this is a big, big problem. So firstly, this could cause emotional harm to the participants because, similarly to something we discussed previously, the fact that the personal information is online is going to make them a bit worried because they don't know who could be viewing this and who could use this against them. So mainly for the participants here, it'll be emotional harm, and for the researchers, this could actually be very severe because they're breaking the Data Protection Act 1998, which is against the law. So they could go to court. The parents could take the researcher to court here. He could be given a fine, a very, very large fine for putting personal information on a website, and potentially even a prison sentence, because this is very serious, putting very personal information on a website where thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are going to view this. So this could potentially lead to maybe a prison sentence for this researcher.